I'm Chris Petty. I'm one of the coordinators for the Colorado Front Range chapter of the American Pilgrims on the Camino. And I am just so honored that Reverend Wesley Granberg-Michaelson agreed to chat and share some insights from his book. And here's a copy of my book, and you can see what I do when I read it. That it's Without Oars, Casting Off into a Life of Pilgrimage. And Reverend Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, his publicist says that he's an author, a global ecumenical leader, and a widely respected voice relating faith to pressing issues of public life. And his international travels have helped him to interpret how the changing face of Christianity is reshaping the future. And he walked the pilgrimage in 2018 in Spain. And since then, that's enriched his commitment to the inward spiritual journey in contemplative practices. He actually started out as a legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Mark O. Hatfield. And he did that early on in his career. And then he decided he needed to go on pilgrimage himself. And then he changed careers, and he served 17 years as General Secretary of the Reformed Church of America, also as Director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches, and currently works with the Global Christian Forum. His book, Without Oars, received the Bronze Medal from Illumination Awards for the best book on spirituality in 2021. And he speaks to various universities, conferences, and churches, and he has a passion for witness and advocacy and social justice. He's a graduate of Hope College, Western Theological Seminary. He has 2 honorary doctorate degrees, and he serves on boards of Sojourners Magazine, Church Innovations, and Global Christian Forum. He currently lives with his wife, Karen, in their home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it says you enjoy fly fishing.
That's the best part of the introduction right there.
Well, you'd fit in with a lot of folks in Colorado, because there's a lot of folks here who enjoy fly fishing as well, too. Yeah. So, Reverend Granberg-Michaelson, would you like to just give a few introductory remarks and talk a little bit about your book?
Sure, and I see some of you have it. It's really great to be with some of you who are with American Pilgrims on the Camino. It's a group that I have known about and have actually wanted to connect to, and I'm really glad that Christine reached out to me and that we could have this time with the Colorado and Front Range chapter. I'm also glad to know about your work, Anne, and the extensive pilgrimages you've done and will continue to do. Christine has sent me more videos than I've had time to watch yet, but they're terrific. And it's wonderful to be exposed to those of you here in this part of the country that have this same passion. Santa Fe is right at the bottom edge of the Rockies, and so feel pretty connected. You just, you've probably been down here if you're from Colorado, and you just drive up along the Front Range in order to get to Denver or where else you're going. So thank you for taking the time. You're all familiar with pilgrimage. Some of you have been on the Camino. All of you, I think, have had some experience. So I don't want to go over things that are already known to you. And I want to get right into discussion, because I think there's unlike some other groups I talk to, you'll have better informed questions to ask, because you really know what I'm talking about. I thought I might just put out a few things in an introductory way. They're themes that are in the book, but they're things that I find that make pilgrimage relevant, particularly as a spiritual practice today. And so I said to Christine, maybe I'll just do that for 5-10 minutes, then we could get right into some dialogue. The first is this: pilgrimage breaks us free from distractions. And I think more than ever, we have to learn how to get detached from the normal avalanche of distractions that come at us in every way. After I wrote the book, I read an article in the New York Times by someone called Michael Goldhaber, who was talking about the attention economy. And this was fascinating to me. His thesis is that attention is now the currency and the power that drives the economy. And you think about that. Everything and everybody wants to get our attention. And the problem is that attention is a limited commodity. I mean, why is Elon Musk going to pay billions of dollars if approved for Twitter? It's because he knows attention drives the economy. And the more you get attention, the more power you have. And that means for all of us, particularly those of us from a Christian perspective, and those of us who really understand the meaning of pilgrimage, we have to pay attention to where we pay attention. Attention is a limited commodity. We have to pay attention to where we pay attention. And pilgrimage is one thing that forces us to do that. And that's one reason why I think it's a really important experience to hold up and to practice. Because a pilgrimage detaches us from the normal things that absorb our attention. It detaches us from these. It detaches us from just the whole environment of media, and that step of detachment brings the opportunity of greater attention, a deeper attention. Henry Nouwen, whom I had the privilege of knowing before he died, Henry Nouwen used to say, prayer is attention. You think of that, prayer is attention. And when you pay attention, then that allows for a deeper kind of connection. So I sometimes like to think of that little progression from detachment to attention to connection. And I think that's what probably all of us, if we think about it, in one way or another have experienced on pilgrimage. And it raises, at least it opens space for the important kind of questions to emerge. I did a study guide that goes with the book, a reflection guide. It's free, you can download it. But I tried to think of 10 questions which go with each chapter. And one of the questions that I love, which relates to what I'm saying now, is this: why am I who I am, where I am? Why am I who I am, where I am? Just having the ability to focus on a question like that, which often pilgrims do, sometimes almost unconsciously, but they get to that point. So I think that's one thing that I just wanted to lift up. The second is like it, but it's, what do we leave behind? I know one of the powerful metaphors in pilgrimage is what you leave behind. And of course, I'm sure every one of you, I think practically every pilgrim who's been on the Camino, certainly for me, you take all this time laying everything you want to pack out on your sofa and going through these lists and we're only going to take what's absolutely essential. And then you get there and you start walking and realize you have too much. And you gotta lay stuff behind. And of course, that becomes a great metaphor for understanding our own walk. And particularly for what we call the second half of life. I don't know I think some of you are from Catholic backgrounds. You probably are familiar with Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr has been a friend, and I really have been helped by his work. His most popular book was Falling Upward. He's written a ton of books, but his book, Falling Upward, has sold more than anything else, translated into several languages. And it's about what he calls the second half of life. And you find the same thing in Jungian psychology. You find it in many places. The thesis is that you go through kind of the first half of your life and you're putting all your accomplishments and security and identity together in a well-formed way. But it's kind of living life according to external expectations. And you come to a point where you begin to say, is there a second half to this? Is there something deeper that I'm called to? Whose life am I living? Whose life am I living? And that's a question that I think also you find on pilgrimage, and from many pilgrims. I'm sure, you're on pilgrimage, you meet people. The first question, you introduce yourself, you say your name, where you're from, and then you don't say, oh, I'm an electrical engineer, or I'm a pastor, or the next question is, why are you on this pilgrimage? And you don't live according to what your external role is. You get exposed to why you are there. And, there are all these different reasons. Christine, she told me she was a volunteer at the Pilgrim office and took surveys. And, about a third of the people are there for religious, a third for spiritual, and a third, they're just kind of searching. And a lot of those people are, at least I found, are at positions where they're changing their career, they're between jobs, or they're kind of wondering what to do. And they're wanting to explore what you could call the second half of life. And what, in that way, you think more broadly about what we need to leave behind in order to step forward where we feel God may be calling us. The third thing is real simple. It's that pilgrimage is always an inward as well as an outward journey. When I'm sure you've had this experience, you talk to other people, they want to ask you about the Camino and so forth. What they don't understand is that pilgrimage isn't just about where you're going. It's not just about an external trek to someplace. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but it's just as much about an inward journey, what's happening to you within in that process. Maybe some of you know this book, Image and Pilgrimage in Christian Culture. It's a big academic tome. It's probably the best academic book written about this. It was written by Edith and Victor Turner. I've browsed through it. It's, it's an academic study. It's got a lot of interesting things in it. But there's a quote from them, which I think I keep running over in my mind, and it sums up a lot. And it's this: pilgrimage is extroverted mysticism, just like mysticism is introverted pilgrimage. You got to think about that. I like that. Pilgrimage is extroverted mysticism, just as mysticism is introverted pilgrimage. It's another way of simply saying there's always an inward and outward journey. And I think that's a lesson that we need deeply in this culture. And then finally is, I thought I'd mention, is just this issue of control. And because of COVID, I think the questions of our inability to control what we thought we could have become so much more existential and real to us. And pilgrimage always presents this, because you go on a pilgrimage and you're not in control. You don't know what is going to happen in your next step. I mean, you know kind of where you want to go, but you don't know what's going to come on your pathway. So you're completely dependent upon grace, upon, of course, the role hospitality has always played in pilgrimage, but you're learning to live your life in a different way. There's a poet, David White, some of you probably know, has a wonderful line. What happens when life is more than you can plan for? What happens when life is more than you can plan for? And I think the experience of pilgrimage introduces us to a time when we lose our ability to control things in the way in which we're accustomed to, And I think that becomes a really important lesson for us. So those are just 4 thoughts that I thought for those of you who know pilgrimage, they might add a dimension. Maybe you already thought about all these things, or maybe they just add another lens through which you look at this experience. So, Christine, I hope that's just a helpful way to stimulate the discussion at the beginning.
I think that's a wonderful way to start that. Does anyone want to start out with any questions? Otherwise, I've got a few that I could start out with myself. I know Mary Jo and Jim, I see that you got the book and you've read it, and I think some other folks have as well too. So I just want to offer an open forum right now if anybody wants to start it out. Otherwise, I will start some questions and we'll go from there. I don't see any hands up right now. So let me just go to a different view to gallery view.
Anna, do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Take it away, Chris.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I noticed was in your book, you talk about each of our journeys carries baggage, and it's overweight, and it talks about, what should we leave behind? And yet when we come back from pilgrimage, and your book talks about casting off into a life of pilgrimage, how do we leave some of that control and that baggage behind in our everyday lives? Because to me, it's a little easier to do when I'm off somewhere else on pilgrimage. But then when I come back to my real life, I find that's kind of a challenge.
Yeah, I agree, Christine. I think that, some people have said the real test of pilgrimage is what happens when one returns. How has this really changed how you walk through life? Or has it just been a very rich and good experience? And I think that's probably a struggle for all of us. I find that, at least in my experience, pilgrimage deepened my commitment that had already been ongoing for many years, but my commitment to try to always be on an inward contemplative journey while being very engaged outwardly in the normal things of life and in a lot of causes and activities that I've been committed to. And I think that practices which provide space for that inner life to grow, that give us some detachment, as we were talking about, that help us to focus on the most important questions, that help us to think about what we may not be able to control the way we thought we could, that deepen our sense of being relinquished and relying on grace. Practices which instill that are about the only way I know to keep what you learn on a pilgrimage back into your normal life. And those kinds of practices are going to be different for different people because of their temperament and because of their personalities. But you've got to do something. You've got to do something. Because, as I said at the beginning, attention is a limited commodity. And there are all kinds of forces that every day want to control our attention. And so we have to pay attention to where we pay attention. And, for some of us, that may mean simply taking a time where we are quiet and centering prayer. It may be in interacting with Scripture. It may be in Lectio Divina. It may be in forms of meditation that also come from some other religious traditions. And it may be on doing walks, doing walks each day. I have friends who take a walk every single day as part of their practice. It may be a commitment to periodically go on retreat. but it means doing something that help keep alive those things that become really intensely focused when you're on a pilgrimage. That's the best way I could respond, Christine.
Those are excellent suggestions, and I know I personally myself try to do some of that myself, but still life does tend to intervene. But one of the things, and for people who haven't read your book, and I became familiar with the Celtic Christianity and Saint Columba a while back, but your book is titled Without Oars, and maybe you could speak to why you titled your book Without Oars and how that relates to some of those Celtic monks from years and years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really interesting. I've become it's only lately that I've become more interested in Celtic spirituality, the forms of Celtic Christianity, and some of you may have dipped deeply into that tradition. Christine mentioned, in fact, in our interaction, the work of John Philip Newell. He's probably been one of the more important people whose writing has really tried to interpret Celtic tradition and Christianity. I don't want to go into a long kind of history course, but what you need to simply remember is that this expression of Christianity, for which St. Patrick, of course, is the most famous, had grown, but as the Roman Empire expanded, and then as Western Christianity out of that expanded, the tradition of Western Christianity really shut down Celtic Christianity and pushed it off to the margins. You can find earlier in Europe big examples of the influence of Celtic spirituality, but then as you get towards the end of the first millennium, it all recedes. But it's still very present today, and many have, and you can go and find those resources. You could go on retreat. Maybe some of you have been to the Iona community, and have seen from there, or have read increasing numbers of things about Celtic Christianity. Now, as it happens, in this tradition, and this is history, this isn't myth, in the year 891, there were 3 Irish pilgrims. Their names actually were Dubslane, Macbeth, and Millennium. And they were in Ireland, and they set out in a boat made of hides of animals. They had enough food for 7 days, and they purposely had no oars. They wanted to go wherever the Spirit of God would direct them. And it's, of course, any of you who know a little bit about the Bible and about Hebrew, you might realize that the word for wind and for spirit and for breath is the same Hebrew word, ruach. So you think of that. The 3 Irish pilgrims get into a boat without oars and set off. The 7th day, they land in another territory in what is today Cornwall, England. And they're convinced that that's where they are supposed to be. And that legacy then continued. Now, that's and you could find that recorded in the forms of history that we have of that time. They actually record this incident. But earlier, many Celtic pilgrims and monks had this practice. There's a Latin name for it. I'm not real good at Latin, but it's peregrinatio por amore Deo, which means wandering for the love of God. And they would set out on these treks. Christine mentioned Saint Columnus, and he was 300 years earlier in 591. He went with 12 Irish monks as pilgrims into Europe. And they went throughout Europe. There are monasteries that still exist today. They were set up by his pilgrimage. You know, you probably heard about how the Irish saved civilization. It was a popular book about a decade ago or so. A lot of those stories are found. I think it was Thomas Cahill who wrote that. So stories like that appear, and it's clear that Celtic monks and pilgrims who wandered, and they wandered throughout Europe, had a deep influence. When I was on the Camino, some of you probably would know this right away, but when I got into Galicia, I suddenly realized that it has, and I'd read about it too, that this has a deep Celtic influence. Well, how, you know, at first, how in the world did that happen? Well, if you take a map, just take a map of Europe and look at where Ireland is and go straight south, you end up in northern Spain. So the Celts went many places in Europe, but included in northern Spain, and that's why the Celtic influence is actually in that region to this day. There's another story, Christine, that some of you might have heard of. It's of Saint Brendan of Clonfert. He didn't go by land, he went by boat and took 17 monks and sailed to the east, again going wherever the spirit and wind would take him. Well, this thing becomes a legend. I mean, it's hard to separate truth from myth, but it is said that these 17 monks in his boat sailed for 7 years before they returned and came back with all these stories, which then get published in the Navigatio. This is a book that becomes wildly popular during that time, but it tells the stories of these wandering these wandering pilgrims, in that case going by boat. So yeah, those are just three examples. I'm not, you know, you could find lots of people who are real experts in Celtic life and spirituality, but that gives you a little taste. And it is from that experience that I drew the title for the book, Christine.
Okay. Well,
and I think the metaphor is great, because, you know, without oars, it means relinquishing the kind of control that we normally depend on in order to be more open to what we might experience.
You know, it's interesting as people walk the Camino today, and I think this has become even more so since COVID, that people are booking their stays more regularly along the way rather than being open to see what is available for them and where they can find a bed. But I think because particularly since COVID, the uncertainty as to how many beds are going to be available in an albergue, what albergues are going to be open, what ones are closed, that there is more of this control issue right now with walking than there was probably in previous years.
Yeah, that's I'm sure that's true. A good friend of mine. It's a tragic story. I mean, he was a fellow pastor. He was an ELCA pastor in a Lutheran church. Anyway, he and his wife are very close friends. He died last summer in a freak accident hiking with his family in Utah. But before that, he went on the Camino with his son. And it was after I had gone, and we had talked a lot about it. But it was so interesting because he and his son, they insisted on planning where they were going to go and where they're going to stay each night. And I tried to say, well, you can do that, but it's, you really lose something. Now, maybe some of you have been through that same experience, trying to debate, what you would do or not do. But sure, you set out and you have an idea where you want to end up, and you hope you get there early enough where they'll have beds. And sometimes you can place a call, and they don't exactly give you a reservation, but they say, yeah, you'll probably be okay. We look forward to seeing you. It does leave you more open to that experience of not having everything managed and predicted.
It does. Anne had to leave, but because she wanted to spend some time with Father Finbar, where in the monastery where she's staying. But she had a question that she wanted particularly wondering about the balance of hermitage, speaking to detachment and the inward versus the outward journey and paying attention. But you aren't walking. You're basically staying in a hermitage somewhere. And
Yeah.
I know during COVID, I think it was in the early 2021, she spent time in a cave in New Mexico
Mm.
for several months, and that was her hermitage,
Yeah.
and that was her hermitage pilgrimage. And how do you view this? Because it's not, particularly, it's not as stimulating as walking as one would do on a pilgrimage per se, but it's more intentional.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the funny thing is, a lot of us were in hermitages during COVID, whether we knew it
That's
or
true.
not. I mean, that was one of the really interesting things about COVID, frankly, that it did put many of us into a kind of isolation we weren't accustomed to, um, there's some obvious tension and loss in that, but there are also some potential learnings in that. But you go to a monastery and just your regular life in a monastery. I spent a month some years ago in a Trappist monastery, and it's a life that is really detached from the outside society, and it's a very it's a bubble, but it's designed in order to allow you to go on a deeper interior journey. That's the way it's like. That's where Anne is now. But the interesting thing is that in some monasteries, not all, but certainly Trappist ones, and there's a monastery, there are two monasteries here in New Mexico. One of them is the Benedictine monastery in Pecos, which is not too far from me, and they have 3 hermitages there. And then there's another monastery. It's actually the Norbertine Abbey, which is just south of Albuquerque. It's a beautiful place. I'd encourage any of you, if you want to come down to New Mexico and we're looking for a place to visit or even stay, to think about the Norbertine Abbey. They're just building. I was just down there, 3 weeks ago, and talking to the abbot, and they're building new guest facilities, and they're building 5 new hermitages. Because people want to have this experience, and it's an even more intense experience, as you say, Christine, that where you isolate yourself, and you may be there alone for the whole time that you wish, or you may join in some of the monastery worship services, but it is a focused kind of experience that's intended to fully detach one from the normal external environment. One of the interesting things is that Thomas Merton did some of his most interesting writing in our hermitage, and at his monastery in Kentucky. And his time he spent in his monastery was well known, and of course Merton ended up engaging himself in letters and in issues around war and race and so forth. It's not like he removed himself from the concerns of the world. He removed himself from that physical pressure in order to place himself in a more isolated place. It is different than pilgrimage, for sure, because, as you say, a hermitage takes this vow of stability with complete seriousness. and there's a big, within contemplative movement, some of you probably know, there's a there's a tension, or there are different ways. Um, some take the vow of stability, meaning being in the same place and remaining there, very, very seriously. Other forms of such life uh, take put more importance on one's movement throughout the world. So it's, you know, it's not that one is right or wrong. Pilgrimage is a form of spiritual practice that has always tried to reimagine how we enter into our daily life in ways that open us to the deeper level of spiritual experience by going to where we've never been. A walk with holy purpose to a place of spiritual significance. That's how, I don't know, I kind of came up with that, but that's how I like to define pilgrimage: a walk with holy purpose to a place of spiritual significance. But some really find the value in that. I do. But I tell you, I also have had that experience of taking a retreat time at a monastery and find that in a different way also enriching. So I don't know if Anne would probably have a lot more to say about that, but that's how I'd kind of come at it.
Okay. Well, in your book too, you speak a lot about social justice as well too, and you mentioned Thomas Merton and some of his what he got involved with and wrote about as well. How do you view pilgrimage and social justice fitting together?
Yeah, I mean, you see, to me, that is a really, that's really a challenge, because I know, I know friends who are very active in wanting to work for what they believe is God's preferred and promised future for the world, and working in all kinds of ways for to see that God's reign would come about. And they'd say, well, isn't it kind of selfish and individualistic to take a month and just go wandering around Spain? What good does that do? How's that going to change the world? What I've come at that in two ways, Christine. The first is that I find amongst my friends and colleagues who are very involved in social change and social activism, and in most cases they're fellow Christians. I mean, we make common cause with others, but I'd speak particularly about fellow Christians at this point. They can so easily become burned out and become disillusioned. And if they're not dealing with their own interior life and the issues they have to face there, they'll end up projecting that on others. And I've seen this happen with people whom I really admire. I think the people who have long-term effect in social change are those who also have learned how to integrate their own inner spiritual life by whatever practices help. And you could name many names, but just look at Dorothy Day. You could make a long list of people, and you'd say, well, they stand out because they paid attention. Now, but the second thing is that I've thought, and in chapter 9 in my book, if you have read it, you'll see, I think a lot about pilgrimages which have the intent of addressing injustices in the world. And when you think about it, there are lots of these, and I think they have real power. The late John Lewis, who was the member of Congress and, of course, came from the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, was injured so bad at the Pettus Memorial Bridge. He, as a member of Congress, got fellow members, Republicans and Democrats, and invited them on pilgrimage to the South, to the sites of the civil rights struggle. And he specifically called it pilgrimage. The guy who ran these for him, Doug Tanner, I've talked to many times, and he told me about how he would do this. And so he would attempt to take those who were his colleagues in Congress and take them on what he called a pilgrimage, but to these places in order to encounter the reality that occurred there. But you think of a lot of the marches. How often are, even today, when people want to express themselves around issues of justice, they march, they walk, they move, they move from one place to another. And often there's great symbolism in where they go to. I think, like I've said to folks, you could think about doing pilgrimages in the U.S. In a similar way. You can go to particular sites if, for instance, in a time when an era of racial reckoning has been so much a part of all of us. Well, you could go to sites in an act of pilgrimage in order to deepen your own encounter with that reality. You could take a holy trip to a place of spiritual significance. So I think pilgrimage, I'm not saying pilgrimages should necessarily be that way, but they can also function as acts that are trying to express what those feel are God's intentions for the world. I used to be on the staff and on the governing body of the World Council of Churches, and every 7 years they have an assembly. The next one's coming up in Germany in this August. The last one was in Busan, Japan, and get about 3,000 people, leaders from churches from all over the world. But they always establish a theme for those 7 years. The theme of the World Council for the last 7 years has been a pilgrimage of justice and peace. Exactly how they named it. And they've had activities which try to express that. So yeah, I think you can think about a relationship, and those are some of the examples that that have come to mind for me, at least.
Thank you. Are there any questions from anyone who is listening in right now? I don't want to take up the whole time. Mary Jo and Jim, you've got your hand up. Be sure to unmute yourselves.
One thing that struck me about the book, which, by the way, I just downloaded this morning and thought I'd read a few pages to get a sense of it, and I ended up reading it cover to cover.
Oh my gosh. Bless your heart.
Was the interesting discussion that you had, or the things that you presented about institutional churches and religions and faiths and empires, and that it's a natural piece of the human nature to want to put a definition to something. Let's define God, let's define the spiritual nature, and in doing so we build up these bureaucracies and things around it, and it really touched a nerve with me. I think I've told the local group once before, Mary Jo and I met in 1972 while we were in Rome going to school there, but I was at a low point faith-wise or religion-wise, but I still went on Easter Sunday to Vatican Square. We went there, and there was something so deeply spiritual about people from countries all over the world speaking all these different languages that almost gave you a headache.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the service started, we all spoke the same language. At that time it was Latin.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a certain sense of coming together, and that was a spiritual moment.
Mhm.
It was a part of that journey, and knowing that we have not done the Camino yet.
We've been
We've
preparing.
been preparing. We're ready.
Yeah, way back then.
September and October, we're going to try again. But
Oh, great.
I look at it as getting to that spiritual part, or getting to that search for understanding God within, and why. That's why I'm excited to see some of the old churches and things, not for their institutional sense, but for that continuity of people's search for spirituality. And
Yeah.
so, and you said that so well in the book. I just appreciated it.
Well, that is so interesting, Joe. And it's really ironic for me because you talk about, putting, getting faith into all these institutions, which then, take on their own expression and so forth. Well, Christine mentioned I was what they call a general secretary of the Reformed Church in America. Well, this is a Protestant denomination. We don't came out of the Reformation, so we don't have bishops and so forth. Well, a general secretary is has all the responsibilities of a presiding bishop and none of the honors, or so the fact is I ran one of those things for a long time, and I valued it. But one of the things that I write about in the book, and that was true for me on the Camino, is what you're saying, Joe. I came to see that, at least in my tradition, and now I'm talking as a Protestant out of the Reformation, where, we became so intent in putting what we believe into these neat confessional boxes. So if you're Presbyterian, it was the Westminster Confession. If you're Lutheran, it's the Augsburg Confession. If you're Reformed, it's the Heidelberg and the Canons of Dort and the Belgic Confession. And there are like 60 of these written, all of which pretended to be the best one. And of course, and they're all in conflict with one another. But it was all an attempt to kind of try to put together a really rationally coherent sense of what we believe. And for many that come out of that tradition, the assumption is that you think your way into faith. You if you get the right ideas, then and that's what these confessions, that's what they were for. This is the way you get it right in your head. Well, a pilgrimage is the way you walk into faith instead of think your way into faith. It's an embodied practice. And I have come to the conviction that what we think, how we express things rationally is important. The life of faith is one that finally has to be lived. And we, at least those of us who come out of our culture and tradition, we have to do much more in learning how actually we walk our way into faith. And a pilgrimage is a great example of that. Faith finally is not just holding the right ideas in our heads. And it's also not just feeling, but it's the way we finally live and walk and discover God's presence and discover God's reality. And the example you give from Rome is a wonderful example of that. You taste glimpses of experiences that really kind of ground your faith more than just getting the right thoughts in your head. One of Richard Rohr's quotes that I like so much is, is this. He says, wisdom is more than mental effort. Wisdom is more than mental effort. And I think you learn that on a pilgrimage. But thanks, Joe.
Well, any other comments, any other questions from folks in the gallery? Well, this has been fantastic, and I so appreciate you taking the time to talk about your book. And I'm going to show this book again. I'm going to show it there because it is a really excellent.
You digested that, Christine.
I have, and not only do I have my little notes here, I have my notes in the back of the book as well too.
And as Joel is showing it, it is on Kindle, so you can get it electronically. And
that's why I like paper, though. You can't do that on Kindle.
You get it from Amazon or the publisher, Broadleaf Publishers. You get it directly from them. Anyway,
we ordered a paperback too.
Well, thank you again so much, and if no one else has any other questions, I would just again want to appreciate the time that you spent with us. And for those who are in the Colorado chapter, we have a packing seminar on Thursday evening. And
seminar on how you pack?
I'm Packing 101. We're going to have a webinar. Actually, it's not a webinar. It's actually a workshop, but we'll record it and we'll put it on our YouTube channel for people who can't attend. And so we'll be doing that. And then we'll have our third Sunday Tertulia, which is actually on the fourth Sunday this month in April, because Easter was on the third Sunday. And then in May, look forward to a hike in the Colorado Springs area, and we'll be publishing that very shortly. So thank you all for.
Let me just say, Christine, in case I also mentioned this in my book, but if you're ever interested in a traditional pilgrimage that is within driving distance of where you are, well, go to Chimayo, which is just about 25 miles north of where I am. Especially over Holy Week, Good Friday, thousands of people have come from all over to go to the chapel at Chimayo, an amazing story behind it that has a lot of similarities to the Camino. And it's one of the, people don't know about it that much unless in certain circles, but it's one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the United States. And it's nearby to where you are if you're living in Colorado. So.
And in fact, Ann Sieben is going to lead a group of pilgrims this fall from San Luis, Colorado. Actually, she's going to go in reverse. They're going to start in Chimayo, and they're going to walk up towards San Luis, Colorado.
That'll be wonderful.
And San Luis, Colorado is the oldest continuous city in the state of Colorado. And there were a group of monks who were martyred there as well, too, way, way back when. So she'll be going in a backwards route on that pilgrimage. But thank you for mentioning that.
Sure.
Well, thank you again. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Okay, thank you.